Britain is facing a chronic backlog in many public services. This includes record NHS waiting lists, a shortage of housing, delays in the criminal system, and a surge in unprocessed asylum requests. On top of this, there's a cost of living crisis, falling real wages, and the prospect of the highest level of strikes of this century. It seems everything is going wrong at the same time. So how did we end up here? Well, we'll look at the impact of austerity, COVID, Brexit, and other factors such as demographics and declining productivity. The NHS is said to be the closest thing the UK has to a religion these days, but it now faces waiting lists of over 7 million, an all-time record, with a significant proportion waiting over 52 weeks. This is exemplified by a fall in the percentage who are able to receive timely treatment after being diagnosed with cancer. And it encompasses many other areas of healthcare, from accident and emergency, record ambulance waiting times, and mental health. The COVID pandemic was undoubtedly a big factor, a tipping point for many public services, especially the healthcare system. But also it is a crisis that has been many years in the making, with public services being at a stretching point for many years. And the problem is that when you get a crisis like COVID, that when everything's been run on bare bones, it means there's no capacity to deal with the unexpected pressure. NHS never actually experienced a fall in real spending. Its budget was protected against, you could say, the worst of austerity. However, increasing healthcare spending, slightly higher than inflation, is insufficient because of an ageing population, a rise in many health conditions such as cancer, autoimmune diseases, diabetes, and a whole host of others. Also, as a share of GDP, spending on healthcare has actually started to decline slightly. And if we compare the UK to other advanced countries, spending on healthcare is relatively low as a share of GDP. So this combination of ever-increasing demand, the impact of COVID and long COVID, mean the system has been unable to keep up. And the concern is that for the foreseeable future, things are going to get worse. It's a similar story with the criminal justice system. COVID wreaked havoc, creating a backlog of cases. But the problem is that since the end of COVID lockdowns, the problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it's got worse. Research suggests that the problem is going to continue to get worse in the near future, even if court capacity was to be significantly increased with extra spending. It would still take a long time for cases to come down. But also there is the issue, do crimes ever get to prosecution in the first place? Many crimes simply go unreported or unprosecuted. Many police forces are now overstretched and minor crimes go uninvestigated. Just 4% of theft in England and Wales ever led to prosecution. The austerity of 2010 and 15 was particularly focused on government departments like education, public investment, and home affairs. For example, there was a cut in the number of police officers, and public sector investment fell to very low levels. And this contributed to the UK having one of the lowest levels of investment by international standards. And the impact of this is in the long term, UK capacity isn't increasing. At this point, a good question to ask is, how come public services are so underfunded, given that taxes are rising to their highest share of GDP for many years? And this goes back to a fundamental economic problem that since the financial crisis of 2008-09, UK growth has slowed down quite remarkably. Before the crisis, it was averaging around 2.5%. Since then, it's been averaging about 1 to 1.5%. The problem is that UK productivity has slowed down very sharply. This is the output per worker and is related to things like technology and levels of investment. But clearly there's been a very sharp slowdown. Now it is true that this is a global phenomenon. It's not just the UK that has seen a slowdown in productivity, but the UK slowdown has been faster than other countries. So in the past, we could rely on economic growth to enable higher spending. But now we are needing to increase tax rates to try and meet the shortfall, which is of course politically unpopular. And unfortunately, the outlook for the UK economy is pretty grim. Both the Bank of England and the OBR have predicted quite prolonged recession. And again, there are some global factors such as the Ukraine war pushing up oil and gas prices, has it made it difficult for every country. The UK is not unique. But nevertheless, next year, the IMF and OECD are predicting the UK will be one of the worst performing economies in the OECD. One reason for the poor productivity is actually in itself declining health, with a large section of the older population leaving the labour market altogether, which has contributed to labour shortages. This is a combination of people taking early retirement, but also a rise in long-term sickness, often long COVID. Now, whilst I've given a lot of graphs about the state of the backlog and waiting lists, I think this is an issue where everyone has their own personal story, personal anecdote of difficulty getting appointments. So, for example, in my case, I know my sister has had long COVID since April 2020, and the NHS have really not been able to offer any satisfactory kind of treatment or support. The only help she's been able to get is when she looked online and found some private treatments. Now, as a consequence, like many others, she's been working part-time, and this contributes to the lower productivity, lower growth in the economy. So austerity and underfunding of healthcare is a long-term factor itself in lower economic growth. Now, of course, it's not just about money. The cure for chronic fatigue isn't necessarily the most expensive drugs. To cure a lot of the health issues facing the UK, it's not just money that's required, but also tackling the underlying causes, tackling the causes of obesity and heart disease and all these kind of factors. But a real cause for concern is that we are now seeing falls in life expectancy for the first time in over a century. And it's also striking to look at regional life expectancy, which is now showing a sharp north-south divide, with less prosperous areas seeing quite worrying falls in life expectancy. Another serious backlog is occurring in asylum applications. We can say that a surge in asylum applications is partly caused by a rise in boat crossings, but it is also important to say this is not just a lack of funding, because funding has increased very recently, but the system isn't working very well, leading to all these hundreds of thousands unprocessed asylum applications, leaving many people in limbo. Looking more at the causes of all these waiting lists and backlogs, I guess those who are critical of Brexit may point to the backlog as proof of Brexit's failure. I'm not so convinced, because the real cause of these issues is more long-term underfunding and productivity problems which go all the way back to 2010, if not earlier. However, whilst Brexit may only have been a fairly minor cause in the current crisis, I do think it will make it much harder to solve in the future. The OBR predict a 4% loss of GDP due to Brexit because of trade frictions, lower investment, etc. And all the evidence so far suggests this is a very reasonable prediction. And given the low economic growth and strain on public finances, a Brexit cost of 4% of GDP is something the country really can't afford at the moment. Another consequence of short-termism and underfunding we can see in the housing market. In the 1980s, we started to sell off council homes, which was very popular in the short term, but has contributed to a shortage of social housing, even though it's desperately needed. And this has led to record waiting lists in social housing. I mean, it's actually hard to get on the waiting list in the first place, with some people saying the real waiting list is at 500,000. And this shortage of housing has also caused a surge in demand for private rented accommodation and an increase in the price of rents. I recently made a video on the private rented sector and other problems there, which you can check out if you want to. But it is another real area of concern affecting living standards. Another contentious issue with regard to waiting lists is that of immigration, because as you probably know, immigration in the UK has been very high in recent years. And when you have to wait 52 weeks to see the doctor, doesn't allow more people, only worsen the problem. But that would be a mistake to blame immigration, because net migration tends to be composed of people of working age, people who are net contributors to the government finances, paying more in tax and receiving healthcare and benefits. And also, migrants are a crucial component of the NHS, with around 50% of NHS workers being foreign born. Now, if we cut immigration, it would probably lead to much lower economic growth and falling tax revenues, which in a way would exacerbate the problem. Now, I would agree that immigration does contribute to the housing crisis because of the shortage of housing and more people. But from a fiscal point of view, it does tend to actually improve public finances. It's just that, despite the increase in people, often the public services haven't been increased in the necessary areas. Many of the problems are not just due to a lack of money, but there may also be an increasing realisation that if we do want a very good functioning welfare state, we may have to accept, you could say, more European-style tax levels. Otherwise, if we try to maintain very, you could say, American-level taxation, it will almost inevitably lead to a partial privatisation. So that's a choice that we face. So unfortunately, there's a lot of grim news there, a lot of waiting lists, and I'm sure everyone's had some bad experience, and it's going to take quite a while to solve. But I hope this video has been useful, and if you like it, please give it a thumbs up, and leave any comments you have